It all started with a late-night scrolling session on Reddit, one of those nights where sleep seemed like a distant dream. I was browsing through the usual threads when I stumbled upon a post in a forum I had never seen before. The forum was buried deep in the dark corners of Reddit, a place where people shared their most unsettling and supernatural experiences. The thread was titled, "The Room with No Light." Intrigued, I clicked on it, expecting the usual collection of urban legends and ghost stories. But this one was different. The post was short, just a few paragraphs, but it sent a chill down my spine. It described a room in an old, creaky house where the lights would never work, no matter how many times the bulbs were changed. The poster claimed that anyone who entered the room felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something sinister was lurking just out of sight. As I read, I felt a strange mix of fear and skepticism. The story was clearly meant to frighten, but there was something about it that felt too real, too specific. The poster mentioned details that resonated with a vague memory I had buried long ago. A memory from my childhood, in the old house where I grew up. My room was at one end of the house, and my grandmother's room was at the other. Between them, there were two living rooms, each more ominous than the last. One night, I remember leaving my room to go to hers, but as soon as I stepped into the first living room, a wave of dread washed over me. The darkness was thick, almost tangible, as if it were pressing down on me. I tried to turn on the light, but the switch did nothing. The bulb was out, and in that moment all I wanted was to run, to flee from that oppressive darkness. But I didn't. I stood there, frozen in fear, as the silence of the room grew louder, more suffocating. Writing the post brought that memory rushing back, but this time the fear was accompanied by something else, a morbid curiosity. I wanted to know more, to see if there was any truth to the story. The post ended with a warning, a cryptic message that sent a shiver down my spine. If you've experienced this, you know what I'm talking about. Don't dig deeper. Some things are better left in the dark. But it was too late. The seed of curiosity had been planted, and despite the fear gnawing at the back of my mind, I knew I had to investigate. That night I couldn't sleep. The words of the post echoed in my mind, intertwining with my own memories, creating a sinister tapestry of fear and uncertainty. I found myself thinking about that old house, about the nights I spent huddled under my blankets, terrified of the shadows that danced on the walls. I remembered the stories my grandmother used to tell, tales of spirits and curses, things that no one in their right mind would believe. But as the hours ticked by, and the darkness outside my window seemed to grow thicker, I began to wonder, what if there was something more to those stories? What if the darkness in that living room wasn't just in my mind? I decided to go back, to visit the old house. It had been years since I'd last set foot there, and the thought of returning filled me with a deep, unsettling dread. But I had to know. I had to see if the room was still there, if the darkness was still as suffocating as I remembered. I told myself it was just curiosity, that I didn't really believe in ghosts or curses. But deep down I knew there was more to it. I wasn't just going back to satisfy my curiosity. I was going back to face my fears, to confront the shadows that had haunted me for so long. As I packed my bags, the fear began to take hold. What if the room was still the same? What if the darkness was still there, waiting for me? The thought made my heart race, but I pushed it aside. I had to do this. I had to know the truth. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind full of doubts, I set off for the place where my nightmares began. unaware that I was about to step into something far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. As I prepared to dive deeper into the mystery that had clawed its way out of my past, I realized that some stories are not meant to be told exactly as they happened. The memories I had buried for so long were now resurfacing, bringing with them a sense of foreboding. I knew that if I was going to share what I uncovered, I would have to alter certain details, not just to protect the living, but perhaps more importantly, to keep the restless dead at bay. The first thing I did was change the names. It felt like a small, almost insignificant step, but as I typed out the new names, a chill ran down my spine. There was something about the act of renaming the people involved that made the whole experience feel more real, more dangerous. It was as if, by changing their names, I was acknowledging that something truly terrifying had happened, and that it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. I decided to call my grandmother Agnes. The name suited her, a strong, devout woman who always seemed to know more about the world's darker aspects than she let on. But as soon as I typed her new name, I felt a pang of guilt, as though I was betraying her memory. She had passed away several years ago, but I could almost hear her voice, warning me not to dig up the past. The thought made my fingers hesitate over the keyboard, but I pushed forward, reminding myself that this was necessary. Some truths need to be told, even if they come wrapped in lies. For my own name, I chose something plain, unremarkable: John. It was a name that could belong to anyone, a name that wouldn't attract too much attention. But there was something unsettling about seeing myself as John. It felt like I was erasing a part of my identity, distancing myself from the events that had scarred my childhood. Maybe that was the point. Maybe, by creating this new persona, I could shield myself from the terror that was slowly creeping back into my life. The house, too, needed a new name. I couldn't bring myself to call it what it had been, the name my family had used for generations. I settled on Hawthorne House, a name that conjured images of twisted ancient trees and dark secrets hidden in the attic. As I typed the name, I could almost see the house in my mind's eye, its windows dark and lifeless, its walls steeped in shadows. The mere thought of it sent a shiver down my spine, and I had to stop myself from glancing over my shoulder, as though the house itself could somehow reach out to me through the screen. The process of changing names felt like a ritual, each keystroke binding me deeper into the story, into the darkness that I was trying to unravel. I knew that altering the names would create a buffer, a protective barrier between me and whatever it was that haunted those memories. But I also knew that this was a double-edged sword. By changing the names, I was distancing myself from the truth, creating a version of the story that was not entirely mine. And in doing so, I feared I might lose control over the narrative, that the story would take on a life of its own, twisting and turning in ways I couldn't predict. As I continued to rewrite the past, a sense of dread began to settle over me. What if, by changing the names, I was inviting something back into my life? What if the spirits, or whatever they were, didn't take kindly to being renamed, to having their identities erased and replaced? The thought gnawed at me, but I couldn't stop. I had come too far, and the story was already beginning to unfold, pulling me along with it. Each new name I typed felt like a step deeper into the darkness. The shadows of my past were no longer just memories, they were becoming real again, solid and dangerous. And as I crafted these new identities, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something or someone was waiting just beyond the edge of my consciousness for the right moment to strike. In the end, I knew that the names were just the beginning, They were a necessary deception, a way to protect myself and those who were no longer here to protect themselves. But they also felt like an invitation, a calling to whatever haunted Hawthorne House, to come find me, to remind me that some things should never be forgotten. And as I stared at the list of altered names, a cold, creeping fear settled into my bones. I had changed the names, but the terror, the fear, the sense of something lurking just out of sight, that remained as real and as menacing as ever. The post on Reddit was more than just a chilling recollection. It was a breadcrumb trail leading into the unknown. As the days passed, I found myself obsessively returning to the thread, reading and rereading every word, every cryptic hint. The warnings at the end of the post, "Don't dig deeper, some things are better left in the dark," only fueled my curiosity. What was it about this story that felt so eerily familiar, so inextricably linked to my own past? The first clue was a location, a small, forgotten town, nestled in the woods, miles away from civilization. The poster had mentioned a house, ancient and decrepit, standing alone at the end of a winding dirt road. The description was vague, but something about it triggered a memory, a flash of the old house where I had grown up. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a coincidence, that somehow this forgotten place was connected to the nightmares I had tried so hard to forget. Determined to uncover the truth, I began to search for more information. Late into the night, I combed through online forums, databases, and obscure websites, looking for anything that could connect the house in the Reddit post to the one from my childhood. The deeper I dug, the stranger things became. I started receiving anonymous messages filled with cryptic warnings and ominous threats, urging me to stop my search. At first, I dismissed them as the work of internet trolls, but as the messages grew more frequent and more specific, I began to feel a creeping sense of dread. The messages weren't just random. They referenced things that only someone who knew me or knew about the house could have mentioned. Details about the layout of the rooms, the old furniture that had been left behind, even the peculiar way the floorboards creaked in the hallway. It was as if someone or something was watching me, tracking my every move as I delved deeper into the mystery. My heart would race every time a new message appeared, the ominous tone seeping into my thoughts, making me question whether I was truly alone in this investigation. Then the photos started appearing. At first they were blurry, indistinct, images of darkened rooms, shadowy figures, and grainy shots of a house that looked eerily similar to the one I had grown up in. But as I looked closer, I realized that these weren't just random pictures. They were of my old house, taken from angles that only someone inside could have captured. My blood ran cold as I recognized the worn-out armchair in the corner of the living room, the cracked mirror in the hallway, and the peeling wallpaper in the bedroom where I used to sleep. The most disturbing photo of all was one that showed the living room, the very room where I'd felt that overwhelming sense of dread as a child. The room was dimly lit, the furniture covered in dust and cobwebs, but in the center of the room was something that shouldn't have been there, a figure, barely visible, standing in the shadows. It was just a silhouette, dark and featureless, but it filled me with an indescribable fear. The figure seemed to be staring straight at the camera, straight at me, as if it knew I was watching. I couldn't understand how these photos had been taken or who had sent them. My thoughts spiraled into paranoia. Was someone trying to warn me? Or was this a twisted game designed to lure me back to that house? The line between reality and nightmare blurred as I became consumed with the idea that the house was alive. that it had somehow reached out through the void of the internet to pull me back in. I knew I should stop, that I should listen to the warnings and let the past stay buried. But I couldn't. The mystery had taken hold of me, and I felt compelled to see it through, no matter the cost. I started having nightmares again, vivid, terrifying dreams where I was back in that house, walking through its darkened halls, feeling the walls close in around me. In my dreams, the house was different, more decayed, more sinister, as if it had been waiting for me to return, growing stronger in my absence. The more I searched online, the more the boundaries between the digital world and the physical one seemed to collapse. I began hearing strange noises at night, whispers that seemed to emanate from my computer, static that filled the room, even when the device was off. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that someone had been standing at the foot of my bed watching me. Every time I turned on my computer, I half expected to see another message, another photo, another piece of the puzzle that I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. And then, one night I received the final message. It was short, just a few words, but they sent a chill through my entire body. It's time to come home. Attached was a link, just a simple URL, but I hesitated before clicking it. I knew that whatever was on the other side would change everything. My hands trembled as I moved the mouse, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally clicked the link, the screen went black for a moment, and then an image slowly faded into view. It was a live feed, grainy and low resolution, but I recognized the scene immediately. It was the living room of my old house, the same room from the photos, only this time it was different. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and in the center of the room, the figure was back, no longer a blurry silhouette, but clear and terrifyingly real. It stood motionless, staring directly into the camera, as if waiting for me. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart racing, the fear almost paralyzing, but even as I tried to convince myself that it was all just a sick joke, a part of me knew that there was no escaping it. The house was calling me back, pulling me into its darkness. And I wasn't sure if I had the strength to resist. The mystery was no longer just an online puzzle. It was a living nightmare, one that I was inexorably drawn to, even as it threatened to consume me. The drive to Hawthorne House was long and unsettling. As I approached the town where the house was located, the trees seemed to grow denser, their gnarled branches intertwining above the road, blocking out the sky. The sunlight, once warm and reassuring, was now a dim, fading glow, struggling to penetrate the thick canopy. I could feel the weight of the past pressing down on me with every mile, the memories of my childhood merging with the present, blurring the line between then and now. When I finally arrived at the house, I was struck by how little it had changed. The same weathered stone walls, the same sagging roof, and the same broken windows stared back at me, as if the house had been waiting all these years, untouched by time. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It felt like the house was holding its breath, anticipating my return. I hesitated before stepping out of the car, the overwhelming sense of dread from my childhood resurfacing with full force. But I'd come too far to turn back now. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move, to walk up the cracked stone steps that led to the front door. The wood was old and splintered, and as I reached for the handle, I noticed it was already slightly ajar, as if someone or something had left it open for me. The interior of the house was just as I remembered, yet different in ways that made my skin crawl. The furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew. Shadows clung to the corners of the rooms, shifting and lengthening as I moved through the house. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet seemed amplified in the oppressive silence, each sound echoing through the empty halls like a ghostly whisper. I made my way to the living room, the one I'd feared as a child, where the darkness had always felt the deepest, the most malevolent. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop, a sudden, bone-chilling cold that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The room was exactly as I remembered it, the same worn-out armchair in the corner, the same cracked mirror hanging on the wall, the same shadows pooling in the corners like ink. But something was wrong. The atmosphere in the room was thick, almost suffocating, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. I felt a presence, an unseen force, watching me from the darkness, and I could sense its malevolence. My heart began to race, my pulse pounding in my ears as I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls, plunging the room into near total darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I spun around, fumbling for the light switch, but when I flipped it, nothing happened. The lights remained dead, just as they had all those years ago. Panic surged through me as I realized I was trapped in the dark, with whatever was lurking in the shadows. I tried to steady my breathing, to calm my racing heart, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. I could feel something in the room with me, something ancient and full of malice, its presence growing stronger with each passing second. The shadows seemed to move, slithering along the walls, creeping closer as if they were alive. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. But it was there, a voice, low and malevolent, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The sound sent a jolt of terror through me, and I instinctively backed away, my eyes darting around the room, trying to find the source. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, echoing off the walls, filling the room with a dreadful cacophony that made my head spin. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a flicker of movement in the mirror. I turned slowly, my body rigid with fear, and there it was, a figure, dark and indistinct, standing just behind me. It was only a shadow, a mere outline of a person, but it was wrong, twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. Its presence was suffocating, its gaze, or what I imagined was its gaze, boring into me with an intensity that made me want to scream. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare into the mirror, paralyzed by fear. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its energy, its hatred, seeping into the room, wrapping around me like a vice. The whispering grew louder, the words becoming clearer, more aggressive, though I still couldn't understand them. It felt as if the figure was trying to communicate with me, to tell me something terrible, something I didn't want to know. My throat tightened, my chest heaving as I struggled to breathe. I could feel the walls closing in, the shadows pressing against me, the room spinning as the figure in the mirror loomed larger, more menacing. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the whispering stopped. The room fell silent, the air thick with the tension of the moment. For a brief, terrifying instant, I was alone with the figure in the mirror, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. I could feel its cold breath on the back of my neck, could sense its twisted form hovering just behind me. I wanted to run, to flee from the room, but my body wouldn't obey, held in place by an invisible force. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The room was empty, the mirror reflecting only my own terrified face, pale and drenched in sweat. The lights flickered back to life, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the room. But the fear remained deep and gnawing, lodged in my chest like a thorn. I stumbled out of the living room, my legs weak, my mind reeling. Whatever I had just encountered, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was tied to this house, to the darkness that had always haunted it. As I fled the house, the cold night air stinging my lungs, I knew that I had crossed a line, that by returning here, I had awakened something that should have been left undisturbed. But even as I sped away from the house, I couldn't escape the feeling that it wasn't over, that the presence in the living room was still with me, watching, waiting. The whispering echoed in my ears, a dark promise that whatever had been unleashed was far from finished. After that first encounter in the living room, I should have known better than to stay. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from Hawthorne House as possible. But something had taken hold of me, a dark, irresistible pull that made it impossible to walk away. The house had awakened something deep within its walls, and now it wasn't just a place from my past. It was a living entity, its malevolent presence growing stronger with each passing day. The days that followed were a blur of terror and confusion. The events that began in the living room soon spread to the rest of the house, like a stain creeping through the fabric of reality. It started with small, almost imperceptible changes, the air growing colder, the shadows lengthening, and the strange feeling of being watched, even when I was alone. But as time passed, the horror escalated, becoming more overt, more violent. The first night after the encounter, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind against the windows sent a jolt of fear through me. The darkness outside the bedroom door felt oppressive, as if it were alive, pressing in from all sides. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that the fear I felt was a remnant of the strange experience in the living room. But deep down, I knew better. The house was waking up, and it was hungry. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing back and forth just outside my door. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right in front of the door. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, paralyzed with fear, waiting for something to happen. The silence was deafening, the tension unbearable. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps resumed, moving away from the door, fading into the distance until they were gone. I lay there for hours, too terrified to move, every nerve in my body on edge, waiting for the next sign that I was not alone. The next day, I noticed that the house itself had changed. The walls seemed to close in on me, the rooms darker, more oppressive than before. The shadows that clung to the corners of the room seemed to move on their own, creeping across the floor like tendrils of smoke. The house felt alive, as if it were breathing, its very structure pulsating with a dark energy that made my skin crawl. As I moved through the house, I began to find strange, inexplicable things, objects that hadn't been there before, placed in ways that made no sense. A dusty old doll sitting on the dining room table, its glass eyes staring blankly ahead. A pile of rotting leaves in the middle of the hallway, despite all the windows being closed. And then there were the messages, words scratched into the walls, the floors, even the furniture. Leave. Not safe. She's coming. Discovery sent a wave of dread through me, the fear growing stronger, more visceral with each new sign. The house was trying to communicate with me, to warn me, or perhaps to taunt me. The messages were everywhere, scrawled in a frantic, desperate hand, the letters jagged and uneven, as if written in a hurry. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had written them was still here, hiding in the shadows, watching my every move. But it wasn't just the house that was changing. It was me. My mind began to unravel, the lines between reality and nightmare blurring until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. I started to hear voices, whispering, just at the edge of my consciousness, their words unintelligible, but filled with malice. They would come at all hours, in the dead of night or in the middle of the day, whispering, taunting, driving me to the brink of madness. The hallucinations followed soon after. I would catch glimpses of things that shouldn't be there, faces in the mirrors, twisted and deformed, staring back at me with eyes full of hatred. Shadows that moved on their own, slithering across the floor like some malevolent creature. Once, I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, its form dark and indistinct, watching me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. When I blinked, it was gone. But the terror remained, a constant gnawing presence that never left. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the nightmares would come. Visions of the house as it had once been, alive with dark energy, its walls pulsing with a sinister light. I would see myself walking through the halls, the darkness closing in around me, the walls dripping with something thick and black. The voices would be louder in my dreams, screaming at me to leave, to run, to save myself. But I was trapped, unable to move, unable to escape the house's grasp. The final straw came one night when I woke up to find my bed surrounded by figures, shadowy, indistinct, but undeniably real. They loomed over me, their faces obscured, their forms shifting and flickering like the light of a dying candle. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but lie there as they watched me, their presence suffocating. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and I felt a cold hand brush against my face, sending a jolt of terror through me. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The room was empty, the darkness once again still and silent. But the fear didn't leave me. I knew that the house had crossed a line, that whatever was haunting it was no longer content to stay hidden in the shadows. It was coming for me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The next morning, I packed my bags, my hands trembling as I shoved clothes and belongings into my suitcase. But as I prepared to leave, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The house wasn't just trying to scare me, it was trying to keep me. Every time I approached the front door, a wave of fear would wash over me, so intense that it left me gasping for breath. The doorknob was cold to the touch, freezing, as if the house itself was holding it shut. I tried to open it, to force it open, but my hands wouldn't obey, trembling too much to turn the handle. It was then that I understood. The house had me in its grip, and it wasn't going to let go. I was trapped, a prisoner in a nightmare of my own making, and the horror was only just beginning. As I sank to the floor, my back against the door, the walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows lengthening, deepening, swallowing the light. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, closer, filling the room with their malevolent presence. And as I sat there, paralyzed by fear, I knew that whatever was haunting Hawthorne House was no longer content to stay hidden. It had awoken, and it was hungry, and I was the only thing standing between it and the darkness it craved. The days bled into nights, and my sense of reality began to unravel within the dark confines of Hawthorne House. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour, as if the very air I breathed was thick with malevolence. The house was alive, feeding on my fear, and I could feel its hunger growing, a black void that threatened to consume me whole. But it wasn't until I stumbled upon the truth that the full horror of what I was facing became clear. A truth that had been hidden in the shadows for far too long. It started with the discovery of an old tattered journal, buried deep in the attic beneath piles of forgotten belongings. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age, and as I opened it, a cloud of dust rose into the air, carrying with it the scent of decay. The handwriting inside was neat, deliberate, as if the author had taken great care in recording every detail. My heart raced as I read the first few entries, a mix of mundane notes about the house and its history. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone began to shift, the writing becoming more frantic, more desperate. The journal belonged to the house's previous owner, a man named Victor Hawthorne. He had lived here decades ago, long before my family had ever set foot in the place. His early entries spoke of a deep love for the house, a sense of pride in its grand architecture and sprawling grounds. But as the entries progressed, a darker story began to unfold. Victor wrote of strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, disembodied voices echoing through the halls, shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. At first, he dismissed them as tricks of the mind, the result of living in an old, creaky house. But soon, the incidents became impossible to ignore. Victor described a growing sense of dread that settled over the house, a darkness that seemed to seep into every corner, every crevice. He spoke of sleepless nights, haunted by nightmares so vivid that they left him trembling in the daylight. The house, he wrote, was changing, no longer the grand estate he had fallen in love with, but a prison, a place of unimaginable horror. The turning point came when Victor discovered something buried deep within the house's history, something that had been kept secret for generations. As I read further, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Victor's writing became erratic, almost unreadable, as he detailed his discovery. Beneath the house, he found a hidden room, accessible only through a concealed passageway in the basement. The room was small, cramped, with walls lined with ancient crumbling bricks. But it wasn't the room itself that terrified Victor. It was what he found inside. In the center of the room was a crude altar, stained with what Victor could only assume was blood. The walls were covered in strange symbols scrawled in a language he didn't recognize. But the most horrifying discovery was a series of old, withered bones scattered across the floor, remnants of some long-forgotten ritual. Victor's journal entries became disjointed, his words frantic as he described the overwhelming sense of evil that permeated the room. He spoke of a presence, something ancient and malevolent, that seemed to watch him from the shadows, its hatred palpable. Victor realized that the house had been built on a foundation of darkness, its history steeped in blood and suffering. The rituals, he speculated, were part of an old, twisted belief system meant to summon and appease a dark entity that had been bound to the house for centuries. The previous owners had tried to keep it contained, but over time, the bindings had weakened and the entity had begun to awaken, feeding on the fear and despair of those who lived there. The final entries in Victor's journal were almost illegible, the writing shaky and disordered. He wrote of a growing madness, of voices that whispered to him day and night, urging him to do unspeakable things. He described seeing figures in the shadows, twisted, inhuman shapes that taunted him, promising eternal torment. Victor became convinced that the house was trying to claim his soul, to draw him into the darkness that lurked beneath its foundations. His last entry was a desperate plea for forgiveness, an admission that he had tried to destroy the room and its contents, but had failed. The entity, he wrote, was too strong, too deeply rooted in the house. He knew he wouldn't survive much longer. As I closed the journal, my hands trembling, I realized the full extent of what I was dealing with. The house wasn't just haunted by the ghosts of the past, it was a gateway, a conduit for something far darker. The entity that Victor had written about was still here, its presence growing stronger with each passing day. It had been awakened by my return, and now it was intent on finishing what it had started so many years ago. I knew I had to leave, but the house had other plans. The darkness that Victor had described was all around me, seeping into my mind, warping my thoughts. I could feel the entity's influence, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. It wanted me to stay, to join the countless souls that had been trapped here before me, and deep down, I knew that if I didn't escape soon, I would become just another victim of Hawthorne House's curse. But leaving was no longer an option. The house had claimed me, just as it had claimed Victor and all those before him. The doors that once led to freedom now seemed impossibly far away, the walls closing in, suffocating me with their weight. The symbols that Victor had described began to appear on the walls, glowing faintly in the darkness as if they were alive, pulsing with the same malevolent energy that filled the house. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the whispers became screams, echoing through the halls, filling my mind with their unholy chorus. And then, in the depths of my despair, I understood the terrible truth. The house wasn't just a prison, it was a feeding ground. The entity had been sustained for centuries by the fear, the anguish, the suffering of those who had lived here. It thrived on their despair, growing stronger with each soul it claimed. And now, it was my turn. The realization hit me like a cold wave of dread. The house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, bound to the entity that lived within its walls. And I was its latest victim, caught in a web of horror that stretched back through generations. There was no escape, no salvation. The house had claimed me, body and soul, and now it would feast on my fear, just as it had done with all the others. As I sat in the darkness, the walls closing in, I felt the entity's presence all around me, its hatred washing over me like a tide. The symbols on the walls pulsed with a sickly light, and the air was filled with the sound of something wet and heavy, moving through the shadows. I could feel it drawing closer, its breath hot and rancid on the back of my neck, and in that moment, I knew that there was nothing left to do but surrender. The entity had won. It had claimed me, just as it had claimed Victor, just as it would claim anyone who dared to enter Hawthorne House. The darkness closed in, and I felt myself slipping away, my mind unraveling, my body growing cold. The last thing I heard before the darkness consumed me was the sound of the house, creaking and groaning, as if it were alive, as if it were feeding. And then there was nothing. Just the darkness, endless and absolute. The days of eerie occurrences and unsettling discoveries culminated in a night that I would come to recognize as the turning point, where the line between life and death, sanity and madness, was irrevocably crossed. By this time, the house had fully ensnared me in its web of horror, leaving no room for escape, only the inevitability of a final, terrifying confrontation. It was late, the kind of night where the darkness outside feels thicker, more impenetrable, as if the very air is saturated with malevolence. The house was unnervingly silent, the usual creaks and groans of the old structure absent, as though it was holding its breath, waiting. I sat in the living room, the journal of Victor Hawthorne clutched in my trembling hands, its revelations echoing in my mind like a death knell. I knew that something was coming, something that had been lurking just out of sight, growing stronger, more determined with each passing day. The first sign was the cold, a deep, unnatural chill that seemed to seep from the very walls, frosting the windows and turning my breath to mist. The temperature plummeted so quickly that it felt as though I had been plunged into the heart of winter. My fingers went numb as I clutched the journal tighter, the paper crackling under the pressure. I knew instinctively that the entity was near, that it was gathering its strength for the final act. The lights began to flicker, casting the room in a strobe-like glow that made the shadows dance and shift in unnatural ways. The air grew thick, heavy, with a sense of impending doom, as though the house itself was exuding an aura of pure malice. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a hammering reminder of my own fragility. I could feel the entity's presence, more powerful than ever before, as if the house was a living, breathing creature and I was trapped inside its very core. Then the whispers started. They came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, a cacophony of voices overlapping, blending into a single, chilling chorus. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable, threatening, mocking, filled with a hatred so intense that it felt as though the very walls were imbued with it. The sound wrapped around me like a vice, tightening with each passing second, squeezing the air from my lungs until I was gasping, choking on my own fear. The room seemed to warp and distort, the walls bending and stretching as though they were made of liquid. The shadows grew darker, more oppressive, taking on shapes that were almost human, but wrong. Twisted, malformed figures that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. They reached out with elongated arms, their fingers ending in sharp, claw-like tips, grasping at the air, at me. I could feel their cold touch on my skin, a sensation that sent a jolt of terror through my entire body. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the figures in the shadows moved closer, their forms solidifying into something far more tangible, far more threatening. I tried to move, to run, but my legs refused to obey, as though they had been rooted to the floor by some unseen force. Panic surged through me, a desperate, animalistic need to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The room was a prison, and the walls were closing in, the space shrinking with every breath I took. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the figure appeared. It was the same dark silhouette I had glimpsed in the mirror, now fully formed, standing at the center of the room. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was a physical presence, a being of pure malevolence, its form shrouded in darkness so deep that it seemed to absorb the light around it. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, glowed with a faint, eerie light, like embers in the depths of a dying fire. The air around it shimmered with a heat that contrasted sharply with the freezing cold, a paradox that made my head spin, my senses scream in confusion. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, filling the room with an oppressive energy that pressed down on me from all sides. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, the words, now clear, cutting through the air like knives. You cannot escape. You belong to us. The sound was everywhere inside my head, reverberating through my bones, shaking me to my very core. I tried to speak, to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was constricted, my voice stolen by the sheer weight of the terror that engulfed me. The figure began to advance, slowly, deliberately, its movement smooth and fluid, like a predator closing in on its prey. The shadows seemed to follow it, clinging to its form like a second skin, writhing and shifting with each step it took. I could feel its intent, its desire to consume, to drag me into the darkness where it dwelled, where there was no escape, no light, only endless suffering. As the figure drew closer, I felt a cold, slimy tendril of fear wrap around my heart, squeezing until I thought it might stop beating altogether. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, a putrid stench that made my stomach churn, my eyes water. The room seemed to tilt, the walls bending inward, as though the house itself was collapsing around me, crushing me beneath its weight. In a final, desperate attempt to break free, I threw the journal at the figure, hoping against hope that it might do something, anything, to stop it. But the book passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke, falling to the floor with a dull thud. The figure didn't even flinch, its glowing eyes fixed on me, filled with a hunger that went beyond anything I had ever known. Then, without warning, the figure lunged. The shadows surged forward, enveloping me in a suffocating darkness that smothered all light, all sound. I felt its cold, clammy hands on me, pulling me down, down into the depths of the house, into the heart of the darkness that had been waiting for me all along. The whispers became screams, a chorus of agonized voices that echoed through my mind, tearing at my sanity, my very soul. I fought with everything I had, clawing at the air, at the walls, at the figure itself. But it was no use. The darkness was too strong, too powerful, and it was pulling me under, drowning me in its inky blackness. My vision blurred, my thoughts fragmented, and I felt myself slipping away, my consciousness fading as the house consumed me. But just as I was about to give in, to let the darkness take me, something inside me snapped. A surge of adrenaline shot through me, and I found the strength to fight back, to push against the overwhelming tide of terror that threatened to pull me under. I reached out, grasping at the last shred of light, of hope that remained within me, and with a final, desperate scream, I tore myself free from the figure's grasp. The darkness receded, the shadows pulling back as the room snapped back into focus. The figure was gone, the whispers silenced, and I was alone, lying on the cold, hard floor, gasping for breath. The air was still thick with the stench of decay, but the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on me was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness that filled the room. I dragged myself to my feet, every muscle in my body trembling, my mind reeling from the encounter. The house was silent. The only sound, the ragged gasps of my own breath. I looked around, half expecting the figure to reappear, to drag me back into the darkness. But the room was empty, the shadows, once again, still and lifeless. But I knew better than to believe that it was over. The house had let me go, but it wasn't finished with me, not by a long shot. I could still feel its presence lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. The darkness had retreated, but it was still there, watching, waiting, hungering. And as I stumbled out of the house into the cold, dark night, I knew that I had only just begun to understand the true horror of Hawthorne House. The entity had spared me for now, but it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. The terror wasn't over. It had only just begun. And next time, I might not be so lucky. I fled Hawthorne House that night, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins, propelling me forward with a frantic urgency. The cold night air bit at my skin, but it was nothing compared to the bone-deep chill that had taken root in my soul. I didn't stop running until I was far from the house, my lungs burning, my heart pounding in my chest. Only then did I allow myself to glance back, half expecting to see the dark silhouette of the figure standing in the doorway, watching me with those glowing eyes. But the house remained silent, its windows dark, as if it had slipped back into the shadows, biding its time. But even as I stood there trying to catch my breath, I knew that I wasn't truly free. The entity that haunted Hawthorne House had released its grip on me, but it had left its mark, a stain on my soul that would never wash away. The house was behind me, but its presence was still with me, a shadow that clung to my thoughts, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to resurface. I drove through the night, my hands shaking on the wheel, my mind replaying the events of the past few days in a relentless loop. The terror I had experienced in the house was unlike anything I had ever known, a deep, primal fear that had seeped into every fiber of my being. But what terrified me even more was the knowledge that the house was still out there, its dark secret buried deep within its walls, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander into its clutches. I returned to my life, trying to put as much distance between myself and Hawthorne House as possible. But the house had changed me in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. My dreams were plagued by nightmares, visions of the house, and the entity that dwelled within it. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, convinced that the shadows in my room were moving, that I could hear the faint whispers of the entity calling to me from the darkness. The nightmares grew more frequent, more vivid, until they began to bleed into my waking life. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, flickers of movement, dark shapes lurking just beyond my peripheral vision. The whispers that had haunted me in the house followed me home, their voices faint but insistent, always just at the edge of hearing. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a result of the trauma I had endured. But deep down, I knew the truth. The entity had followed me, and it was only a matter of time before it made its presence known. One night, I awoke to find myself standing in the middle of my living room, the lights off, the house shrouded in darkness. I had no memory of getting out of bed, no recollection of walking downstairs. My heart raced as I realized that I wasn't alone. The air was thick with the same oppressive energy that had filled Hawthorne House, a suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe. I could feel the entity's eyes on me, watching from the shadows, its hunger palpable. I stumbled back, my legs weak, my mind reeling with fear. The darkness seemed to close in around me, the walls of my home warping and bending just as they had in Hawthorne House. The whispers began again, louder this time, their words clearer, more distinct. "You cannot escape. You belong to us." The sound filled the room, echoing off the walls, reverberating through my skull, making my head throb with pain. I tried to flee, to get out of the house, but the darkness was everywhere, thick and cloying, wrapping around me like a shroud. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the entity was desperate to claim me, to drag me back to the house where it had first found me. I could feel its presence closing in, a cold, clammy hand brushing against my skin, its touch sending a jolt of terror through me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The whispers fell silent, the darkness receded, and I was alone in my living room, the lights flickering back to life. But the relief was short-lived. I knew that the entity had not truly left. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The house had claimed me, and it wasn't going to let me go. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. The entity made its presence known in subtle ways. Doors that creaked open on their own, lights that flickered even when the bulbs were new, shadows that seemed to shift and move when no one was looking. I felt like I was being watched at all times, my every move monitored by unseen eyes. The fear that had taken root in Hawthorne House had followed me home, and there was no escaping it. I tried to seek help, to find someone who could explain what was happening to me, but no one believed me. The few friends I confided in thought I was losing my mind, that the trauma of the house had left me paranoid, delusional. But I knew better. The entity was real, and it was patient. It didn't need to rush. It had all the time in the world to wear me down, to break me. And so, I began to withdraw, isolating myself from the world, afraid that the entity might harm those I cared about. My house became my prison, each room a reminder of the horror that had followed me home. The entity's whispers grew louder, more persistent, invading my thoughts, my dreams, until I could no longer tell where its voice ended and mine began. The final straw came one night when I awoke to find myself standing at the edge of my bed, a knife clutched in my hand. I had no memory of picking it up, no idea how it had gotten there. The whispers were louder than ever, urging me to act, to do something unspeakable. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what the entity wanted, what it had always wanted. It wasn't enough to haunt me, to fill my mind with fear. It wanted to break me, to push me to the edge, to claim my soul, as it had claimed so many others. But I refused to let it win. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to drop the knife, to back away from the edge. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, but I ignored them, pushing them to the back of my mind as I fled the room, desperate to escape the entity's influence. I knew then that there was only one way to end it. I had to go back to Hawthorne House, to face the entity on its own turf, to confront the darkness that had claimed my life. It was a fool's errand, a suicide mission. But I had no other choice. The entity would never stop. Not until it had consumed me completely. I had to end it, or die trying. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind full of fear, I returned to the place where it had all begun. The house loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette a beacon of dread calling me home. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the sky overcast, as if the world itself was mourning what was about to happen. As kijkers toen zijn sterking, zit zijn is deze met je net, niet je dra.